The day I ordered an illegal house torn down on my own land, I knew there would be consequences. I just didn't expect this. The HOA had built it quietly, without permission, without paperwork, on property they didn't own. When I confronted them, they laughed it off, said I was overreacting, said I had no authority to stop them. So I did what anyone protecting their land would do. I removed it, piece by piece. I thought that would end it. Instead, it triggered something far worse, because days later, I opened my mailbox and found a lawsuit accusing me of destruction. How did defending my own land turn me into the villain in their story? Before any house appeared on my land, before lawyers got involved, before the HOA decided, I was their enemy. Life was simple, quiet, predictable, exactly the way I wanted it. I owned a stretch of land just outside a growing suburban development. Not a massive estate, not some flashy property, just enough space to breathe, enough distance from neighbors to feel like I actually own what I paid for. My family had held onto this land for years. It wasn't inherited wealth or some lucky investment. It was a result of patience, paperwork, and decades of careful planning. I lived there full-time, paid county taxes, maintained fencing, kept everything permitted, documented, and clean. No disputes, no violations, no complaints. The land existed in a strange in-between space, close enough to a newer HOA development to see their rooftops in the distance, but legally and clearly outside their jurisdiction. And that distinction mattered, because while Hawthorne Ridge HOA managed a subdivision next door, my property was governed only by county zoning laws. No HOA dues, no committees, no architectural review boards, just the county, the state, and the law. For years, that arrangement worked just fine. Then the subdivision expanded. New streets appeared. New homes went up. The HOA grew louder, more organized, more aggressive about standards and uniformity. Their board meetings became more frequent, their rules more invasive. I watched from a distance, mildly amused, grateful I wasn't part of it. At least, I thought I wasn't. The first sign of trouble came quietly, almost invisibly. One morning, I noticed survey flags along the edge of my property. Small orange markers, half buried in the dirt, running in a line that didn't make sense. They weren't on the HOA side. They weren't placed by the county. And no one had contacted me. I assumed it was a mistake. A contractor confused about boundaries. Something easily corrected. I pulled the flags out and tossed them in the trash. A week later, they were back. More of them this time. Deeper into my land. Closer to the clearing near the road. That's when I started paying attention. I checked county records. Pulled up plats. Rear-viewed my deed. Everything was exactly as it always had been. My land ended where it ended. The HOA began where it began. There was no overlap, no ambiguity, no gray area. Still, the flags kept appearing. Then came the equipment. One afternoon, I returned home to find construction vehicles parked near the boundary line. Not on my land, but close enough to make my stomach tighten. Workers were unloading materials. Lumber, concrete forms, rebar. I asked what they were building. They said they didn't know, just following orders. I asked who hired them. They gave me a company name, one I didn't recognize. When I called the number on their truck, the person on the other end sounded confused. They said the HOA was a client. They said all permits had been approved. They said everything was handled. Handled by who? No one could answer that. The next morning, a foundation was poured. Not next door, not nearby, on my land. I stood there staring at wet concrete slowly setting into the earth I'd walked for years. Earth I paid taxes on. Earth no one had permission to touch. I contacted the HOA immediately. The response was dismissive. They told me the structure was part of a planned community expansion. They claimed boundary lines were under review. They insisted everything would be resolved once paperwork was finalized. Finalized by who? Again, no clear answer. I told them to stop construction immediately. They didn't. Instead, Framing went up, walls followed, roofing materials arrived. Every day, the structure grew larger, more permanent, like they were daring me to stop it. I contacted the county. The county had no record of permits for construction on my parcel. I contacted zoning. Zoning had no application on file. I contacted the contractor directly. They told me the HOA assured them everything was legal. And then, finally, the HOA president contacted me directly. She spoke calmly, confidently, like someone who had never been told no. She said the land issue was being resolved internally. She said I was overreacting. She said tearing anything down would create unnecessary conflict. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said, once it's finished, you'll see it benefits everyone. That was the moment I realized something important. They weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were betting on intimidation. Betting I wouldn't fight an entire HOA. Betting I wouldn't want the stress. Betting I'd let the structure stand long enough for them to claim it was irreversible. They assumed time was on their side. They were wrong. And the moment I decided to push back was the moment everything began to spiral. Once the framing went up, the situation stopped feeling theoretical. It wasn't a boundary dispute anymore. It wasn't a paperwork issue. There was now a physical structure sitting on land I owned, land I paid for, land I had protected for years. And every nail they drove and felt personal. I returned home every afternoon to new progress. Walls standing taller, windows installed, a roof line taking shape. It was surreal, watching something illegal become permanent right in front of me while everyone involved acted like it was inevitable. The HOA didn't notify me of timelines, didn't ask permission, didn't pause construction. They behaved as if resistance was no longer an option. I called the HOA again. This time, I recorded the call. They told me the board had already approved the structure. They said boundary verification was ongoing. They claimed delays would harm community interests. Community interests. As if my land was a community resource they could allocate at will. When I asked why they didn't have county permits, the response shifted. The tone hardened. The polite dismissal gave way to subtle threats. They warned me about interfering with development. They hinted at legal consequences. They suggested I should wait until everything was finalized. Finalized meant one thing. They wanted the house finished before I could stop it. So I went to the county offices in person. I brought my deed, my survey, tax records, zoning maps. The clerk confirmed everything within minutes. The house was illegal. No permit, no variance, no approval, not even an application. The county official used a word that stuck with me: egregious. He told me construction should never have started. He told me the HOA had no authority to build on private land. He told me enforcement could take time. Time was the one thing I didn't have. Because while paperwork crawled through government channels, the house kept going up. Every day that passed made it harder to reverse. Every board meeting they held, without me, made them bolder. I posted "No trespassing" signs along my property line. They removed them. I reinstalled them. They disappeared again. I placed stakes and caution tape. Workers stepped right over them. I confronted the contractor on site. He told me he was just doing his job. He said the HOA threatened him with breach of contract penalties. He said stopping now would cost him thousands. Everyone was pointing fingers. No one was taking responsibility. That's when the HOA escalated. I received a certified letter, not from the county, not from a court, from the HOA's legal committee. They accused me of harassment. They accused me of interfering with lawful construction. They warned me against self-help remedies. Self-help, that phrase wasn't accidental. They were laying groundwork, creating a narrative, building a paper trail that framed me as the problem. If I acted, they planned to claim I was reckless. If I waited, they planned to claim permanence. Either way, they believed they'd win. Then came the fines. I wasn't even in the HOA, But they find me anyway. Daily penalties for disruptive behavior, violations for hostile interactions, notices claiming I was creating a nuisance. I ignored them, but the letters kept coming. Thicker envelopes, more formal language, more urgency. They wanted me stressed, confused, second-guessing myself. They wanted me tired. Neighbors from the HOA development started avoiding eye contact. A few whispered apologies. Others looked at me like I was dangerous, like I was threatening their homes. I realized the HOA had been talking, spinning a story where I was an obstacle, a troublemaker, a risk to property values. They didn't mention they built illegally. They didn't mention permits. They didn't mention ownership. They framed it as one man trying to block progress. And it was working. That pressure, the social pressure, was heavier than any letter. Then one morning, I woke up to find the house nearly complete. Windows installed, doors hung, exterior painted. Standing there, watching sunlight reflect off glass that shouldn't exist, something inside me hardened. The HOA wasn't stopping. The county wasn't moving fast enough. And if I didn't act soon, the structure would be used as leverage against me forever. That was when I consulted a land use attorney. He reviewed everything, every document, every notice, every photograph. And then he said the sentence that changed everything. You are legally allowed to remove unauthorized structures built on your land if you follow specific steps. Specific steps meant documentation, notice, opportunity to cure. I sent the notice. Certified, documented, clear. I gave the HOA 14 days to remove the structure themselves. They responded on day 1. They laughed. They told me I'd regret it. They told me the house wasn't going anywhere. They told me I didn't have the courage to follow through. They assumed I was bluffing. They assumed wrong. Because when the 14 days expired, I made the call that would turn everything upside down. The call that would lead to demolition, to lawsuits, to consequences no one on that board had prepared for. And the moment the machinery arrived, the HOA finally realized this wasn't intimidation anymore. It was action. The morning the equipment arrived, the air felt different, heavy, charged, like the calm before something irreversible. 2 trucks rolled onto my property just after sunrise. A flatbed, an excavator, no flashing lights, no drama, just steel hydraulics and the quiet confidence of people hired to do a job that had already been approved, legally, thoroughly, and carefully. I stood at the edge of the clearing with a folder under my arm. Inside were copies of my deed, survey maps, the formal notice I'd sent the HOA, and the attorney's written confirmation that I had the right to remove the structure if they failed to act. The workers didn't touch anything yet. They waited. That mattered, because I knew what was coming next. Within 20 minutes, cars started arriving. HOA board members, residents, contractors who had worked on the house. People drawn by rumors spreading faster than facts. Then she arrived. The HOA president stepped out of her car like she was walking onto a stage. Sunglasses, perfect posture, that same controlled expression she always wore when she believed she had the upper hand. She demanded the workers stop. They didn't. She told them they were trespassing. They ignored her. She turned to me and accused me of destruction, of recklessness, of trying to sabotage the community. I didn't respond. I handed the crew supervisor the final authorization. He nodded once, and then the excavator arm moved. The first impact wasn't dramatic. No explosion, no collapse, just the crunch of wood as the bucket pressed into an exterior wall that never should have existed. The sound carried. Someone gasped. Someone shouted. Someone started filming. The HOA president froze. She screamed for someone to call the police. She screamed that this was illegal. She screamed that I was ruining everything. But the machine didn't stop. Panel by panel, the house came apart. Drywall cracked. Studs snapped. Roofing slid down in sheets. The illusion of permanence dissolved faster than anyone expected. Within an hour, the structure was reduced to debris. The HOA president stood there, shaking, not from sadness, but from fury. Her plan had failed. Publicly, irreversibly. She pointed at me and said something that would later appear in court transcripts. "You will pay for this." By that afternoon, I had already received the first legal notice. Not from a court, from the HOA. They accused me of vandalism, of property destruction, of intentional harm to community assets. Community assets. They claimed the house belonged to them. They claimed the land dispute was unresolved. They claimed I acted maliciously. They ignored one inconvenient truth. They never owned the land. That evening, my phone exploded with messages, some supportive, some furious, some threatening. The HOA blasted an emergency email to residents. They framed me as unhinged, dangerous, willing to destroy property without warning. They never mentioned permits. They never mentioned notices. They never mentioned the 14 days. They were rewriting history in real time. 2 days later, the lawsuit arrived, filed fast, aggressive, overreaching. They sued me for damages, for emotional distress, for interference with development, for loss of projected value. They even demanded I pay to rebuild the structure. That's when the pressure truly began. Neighbors stopped waving. Cars slowed when they passed my driveway. Online forums lit up with speculation. Some people believed the HOA. Others didn't know what to believe. But one thing was clear. The conflict was no longer about a house. It was about control. About whether an HOA could act like a government. About whether private property still meant anything. About whether intimidation could override law. And the HOA wasn't backing down. They escalated again. They filed a request for an emergency injunction, trying to prevent me from touching my own land. They claimed I posed a continuing threat. The judge denied it. They requested mediation, then canceled it, then requested again. They tried to overwhelm me with process. But during discovery, something unexpected happened. The HOA was forced to produce internal communications, emails, meeting notes, planning documents. And buried inside them, careless, arrogant, and damning, was proof they knew the house was illegal from the beginning. Proof they built anyway. Proof they expected me to cave. That evidence would become the turning point, the moment the lawsuit stopped being a threat and started becoming their undoing. The discovery phase changed everything. Up until that point, the HOA believed they were still in control. They thought lawsuits were weapons, tools to intimidate, exhaust, and outspend. They assumed I would fold under the weight of legal fees and public pressure. That assumption had carried them through years of unchecked authority. But discovery doesn't care about confidence. Discovery only cares about truth. Once the judge ordered document production, the tone shifted overnight. Their emails arrived in waves, hundreds of them, long chains spanning months before construction even began. Internal memos, draft plans, budget discussions, and buried inside those documents was something impossible to spin. They knew, not suspected, not guessed. They knew the land wasn't theirs. One email, sent weeks before the foundation was poured, stood out. A board member asked directly whether the parcel was outside HOA boundaries. The response from the HOA president was chilling in its casual arrogance. She wrote that boundary disputes resolve themselves once structures exist. She wrote that no one wants to fight a finished building. She wrote that resistance would fade once momentum takes over. Momentum, that was their strategy. Build fast, create permanence, dare the owner to challenge it. Another email discussed timing construction to avoid county inspection cycles. Another talked about delaying permit verification until after framing. Another suggested that if enforcement showed up, they could claim administrative confusion. This wasn't incompetence. It was planning. And suddenly, the lawsuit they filed against me looked very different in the eyes of the court. The HOA's attorneys tried to contain the damage. They objected, redacted, delayed. But the judge wasn't patient. Every attempt to stall only invited deeper scrutiny. Meanwhile, cracks began forming inside the HOA itself. Board members who had supported the president quietly stepped back. Some resigned. Others stopped responding to emails entirely. A few reached out anonymously to distance themselves from decisions they had once rubber-stamped without question. The community felt it too. Residents began asking questions the HOA couldn't answer. Why weren't there permits? Why was a house built so fast? Why did the HOA keep losing motions in court? And most importantly, why did they build on land they didn't own? Attendance at HOA meetings plummeted. Trust evaporated. Fear replaced loyalty. Then came the deposition notices. Board members were required to testify under oath. That changed everything. People who were confident in meetings became nervous in private. People who once spoke boldly began choosing words carefully. Memories suddenly got fuzzy. Stories didn't align. The HOA president remained defiant. She insisted she acted in the best interest of the community. She claimed authority where none existed. She doubled down on the idea that I was disruptive and hostile. But paper doesn't forget. Her own emails contradicted her testimony. Dates didn't line up. Statements conflicted. Assumptions collapsed under cross-examination. And then something happened that no one expected. The county stepped in. Because once the judge reviewed the discovery materials, he referred the case to county enforcement for potential zoning and construction violations. That referral alone changed the stakes. This was no longer just a civil dispute between a homeowner and an HOA. This was now a regulatory issue. County inspectors visited the site where the house once stood. They reviewed photos, compared timelines, cross-referenced permits that never existed. Their conclusion was blunt. The construction violated multiple zoning ordinances. The HOA bypassed mandatory approvals. The structure should never have existed. That finding didn't just weaken the HOA's lawsuit. It undermined its foundation entirely. At the same time, whispers spread that the HOA's insurance carrier was getting nervous. Illegal construction meant denied coverage. Denied coverage meant personal liability for board members. That possibility terrified them. Because suddenly, this wasn't about defending a bad decision. It was about protecting themselves. Emails stopped flowing freely. Meetings were canceled. Legal counsel changed strategy. They offered mediation again. This time, it wasn't framed as cooperation. It was framed as damage control. But I refused, not because I wanted revenge, because mediation would bury the truth. And the truth mattered. The HOA tried one final tactic. They amended their lawsuit, softening language, removing accusations, reframing the demolition as miscommunication. They attempted to paint the house as an unfortunate mistake rather than an intentional gamble. But it was too late. The record already existed. And when the judge scheduled a preliminary hearing to review the HOA's conduct, everyone understood what that meant. The court wasn't just interested in whether I had the right to tear down the house. The court wanted to know why it was built at all. That hearing would become the point of no return, because once the HOA president took the stand again, this time with county findings on the record, there would be no place left to hide. And by then, the entire community would be watching. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Not calm, not peaceful. Heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something to break. The HOA president sat at the defense table, perfectly dressed, posture rigid, jaw clenched. She still looked confident from a distance, still looked like someone who believed she could talk her way out of anything. But up close, the cracks were obvious. Her hands trembled when she adjusted her papers. Her eyes darted constantly toward her attorney. She wasn't in control anymore. She knew it. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. And just like that, years of unchecked HOA power collided head-on with reality. The judge didn't start with emotion. He started with facts. He reviewed the timeline, the land ownership records, the lack of permits, the internal HOA emails uncovered during discovery. Each fact landed like a hammer. Then he turned directly to the HOA president and asked a question that changed everything. Did you know the land did not belong to the HOA at the time construction began? There was a pause. Not a thoughtful pause. A trapped pause. Her attorney tried to intervene. The judge shut it down instantly. This is a yes or no question. She swallowed. Then she said it. Yes. The sound in the room shifted. You could feel it, like oxygen draining away. The judge leaned forward. And despite knowing that you authorized construction of a residential structure on private land you did not own, another pause, another attempt to deflect, another interruption from the bench. Yes or no? Yes. That was it. Everything the HOA had argued collapsed in 2 words. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His disappointment was sharper than anger. He read excerpts from the emails aloud. The ones about momentum. The ones about no one fighting a finished building. The ones about delaying permit verification. Each sentence exposed intent, not confusion, not error, intent. Then came the moment the HOA never planned for. The judge addressed the demolition directly. He acknowledged that tearing down a structure is serious, extreme, rare. Then he said something that silenced the room completely. A person has a right to protect their property when no lawful alternative remains. He explained that the HOA had been given notice, that they were given time to correct the violation, that they refused. He stated plainly that the demolition was a legal consequence of their actions, not a reckless act of destruction. And then he turned the lawsuit back on them. He dismissed it, not partially, not conditionally. Dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never file it again. But he wasn't finished. The judge referred the HOA's actions to county enforcement and the state attorney's office for review of potential fraud, zoning violations, and abuse of authority. He also ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees, every single dollar. The HOA president didn't react at first. She just stared forward, eyes unfocused, like someone watching their world end in slow motion. Then the whisper started. Residents in the gallery exchanged stunned looks. Phones buzzed. People leaned toward each other, realizing what this meant. The HOA hadn't just lost a case. They had lost legitimacy. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Word had spread. A local reporter asked questions the HOA president refused to answer. Another asked how long the board had known the house was illegal. She said nothing. She couldn't, because the truth was already public. And once the truth surfaced, everything unraveled fast. Within days, multiple board members resigned. The HOA's insurance provider withdrew coverage. County enforcement issued formal citations. The HOA president stepped down quietly. No announcement, no farewell, no defense, just gone. The illegal house was never rebuilt. The land was restored. And the power the HOA once wielded so confidently, so recklessly, was permanently broken. But the real climax wasn't just legal. It was personal. Standing on my land again, looking at the clear ground where the house once stood, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not anger. Closure. They tried to take something that wasn't theirs. They assumed I'd be afraid. They assumed I'd back down. Instead, they exposed themselves. And that exposure changed everything. Because once people see how power is abused, they never look at authority the same way again. The end of the lawsuit didn't bring immediate peace. It brought silence first. The kind of silence that settles in after something powerful collapses, and no one knows what comes next. For weeks, Hawthorne Ridge felt frozen. The HOA's website went dark. Automated emails stopped mid-cycle. Notices that once arrived like clockwork disappeared completely. Even the clubhouse sat locked most days, lights off, parking lot empty. Residents didn't know who was in charge anymore, and that uncertainty was the first real consequence of unchecked power finally being removed. The county moved quickly once the court ruling became public. Inspectors reviewed not just the illegal house, but every expansion project the HOA had approved in recent years. They combed through records, permits, and financial statements. What they found confirmed what many homeowners had quietly suspected for a long time. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were smaller violations, questionable approvals, rules enforced selectively depending on who was involved, a pattern of behavior that relied less on law and more on intimidation. The county issued formal oversight requirements. The HOA would no longer operate independently for the foreseeable future. Every major decision would require external review. Every future construction project would need documented approval. Every fine would need justification. The HOA wasn't dissolved, but it was no longer feared, and that shift changed everything. Residents who had avoided meetings for years started showing up again. Not angry, not loud, just cautious, curious, wanting to understand how things had gone so wrong without anyone stopping it sooner. At the first restructured meeting, people spoke openly about fines that never made sense, about threats that felt personal, about rules that seemed to change depending on who was enforcing them. Some admitted they had voted for the board simply because it was easier than questioning authority. Others confessed they had known something was wrong, but didn't think one person could make a difference. They were wrong. One person had made a difference. Not by yelling, not by posturing, not by trying to dominate, but by documenting, by refusing to back down, by insisting that law still mattered. As the former HOA president faded from public view, rumors followed. Investigations, legal consequences, civil liability discussions. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just a slow dismantling of a reputation that once felt untouchable. She never returned to the neighborhood. Her name stopped being spoken. Power, once lost, doesn't announce its departure. It just disappears. For me, life gradually returned to something familiar. The land healed. Grass grew back where concrete one Saturday. The boundary marker stayed firmly in place, not as a warning, but as a reminder. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was relief. Relief that I didn't give in. Relief that I didn't let exhaustion decide the outcome. Relief that I trusted the process, even when it moved slowly. Neighbors began stopping by again. Some curious, some apologetic. Some just wanted to talk. They asked how I stayed calm, how I knew when to act, how I didn't give up when the HOA seemed so powerful. The answer was simple. I knew what was mine, and I knew what wasn't theirs. That clarity made all the difference. Looking back now, the illegal house feels almost symbolic. A physical manifestation of what happens when authority stops asking permission and starts assuming compliance. It stood briefly. It looked permanent. It felt intimidating. But it was never legitimate. An illegitimate power never survives scrutiny. This wasn't just a story about tearing something down. It was a story about drawing a line, about reminding people, HOAs included, that power has boundaries, and those boundaries matter. Because the moment you accept overreach as normal, you invite more of it. And the moment you push back with facts, patience, and resolve, everything changes. If there's one lesson in all of this, it's this: you don't need to be loud to be strong. You don't need permission to defend what's yours. And you don't need to fear authority when it's built on nothing but assumption. Sometimes, standing your ground doesn't just protect your land. It protects everyone watching quietly, hoping someone else goes first.